The most humiliating moment of Margaret Colton's life was not when the judge called the courtroom to order. It was not when the attorney opened the envelope. It was not even when her husband's family began to laugh. It was when Douglas Colton, the man she had loved for 41 years, reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, pulled out a worn $2 bill, and slid it across the polished table with the back of his hand. The way someone might brush crumbs from a tablecloth. The way you push aside something that never mattered. He looked down at her when he did it, and the eyes that looked down were not angry. They were not sin. They were simply finished. The way a man looks at a chapter he has already closed in his mind and is now closing on paper. "That's what you're worth," he said loud enough for every person in that room to hear. $2, same as everything your father ever built. His brother laughed first, then his sister. His mother did not laugh, but her lips curved into something cold and satisfied, and somehow that was worse than laughter. His girlfriend, a woman younger than his own daughter, looked away to hide her smile. And Margaret Colton, 69 years old, sitting alone at the plaintiff's table with no attorney and no assets, and a photograph of her dead father tucked inside a leather portfolio, reached for the bill to take it and sign the papers and leave this room forever. But she did not get the chance, because a hand she did not expect closed gently over her wrist, and a man she had not seen enter the courtroom was already sitting beside her, and he had been waiting 30 years for this exact moment. That is where this story truly begins. But to understand what happened next, you need to understand what came before. You need to understand how a woman with a business degree and 2 job offers in a mind sharp enough to retain everything she ever read ended up sitting alone in a county courthouse with nothing to show for 4 decades except a $2 bill in the quiet ruin of everything she had believed about her own life. Margaret Bridwell, before she became Margaret Colton, was not the kind of woman anyone would have predicted would end up here. She had grown up on a farm in the rural part of the county, the daughter of a man named Walter Bridwell, a quiet farmer who drove an old truck and kept to himself and never once in his life made a spectacle of anything. She had earned a degree in business administration from a state university, paying for every credit herself through scholarships and weekend shifts at a diner 3 miles from campus. She graduated with honors. She had 2 offers waiting before she walked across the stage. She chose neither of them. She chose Douglas Colton. They met at a dinner party hosted by a mutual friend. Margaret was 27. Douglas was 29, newly launched into commercial real estate with the energy and certainty of a man who had never seriously doubted himself. He was charming in a specific way that certain men are charming, wholly focused on you in the moment, generous with his attention, the kind of listener who made you feel seen in a way that felt rare and deliberate and meant only for you. On their 3rd date, he told her she was the most capable woman he had ever met. On their 6th, he told her he needed someone like her in his corner. The night he proposed, he took her hands across a restaurant table and said that everything he was going to build, he wanted to build with her. She was 28 years old, and she believed every word. What followed was 41 years of a particular kind of erasure that happens so slowly and so quietly that the person it is happening to rarely notices until it is nearly complete. In the early years, the arrangement seemed sensible enough. Douglas's real estate career required long hours, constant networking, and the kind of social architecture that does not build itself. Margaret stepped in. She managed their home. She raised their daughter Claire through infancy and childhood and adolescence. She raised their son Nathan with the same steady presence, the same consistency, the same invisible labor that no one thinks to acknowledge because it looks from the outside like it simply happens on its own. She hosted dinners for Douglas's clients and colleagues. She learned the names of their wives, remembered the ages of their children, built the warm and seamless social world that made Douglas appear not just successful, but grounded, trustworthy, the kind of man you wanted to do business with. She set aside her own ambitions gradually, the way you set aside something you intend to return to someday. The business ideas she sketched quietly in notebooks during the children's nap times. The management position she was offered at a small firm when Nathan started first grade, which Douglas had gently discouraged with a logic that seemed reasonable at the time. They did not need the money. The hours would be difficult. Who would handle things at home? She had agreed. She had always agreed, not from weakness, but from a genuine belief that what they were building together was worth the investment of her own ambitions. She was not surrendering, she was contributing. That was what she told herself, and for a long time she believed it was true. One evening when Douglas was away on a business trip, her neighbor, Denise Pruitt, sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and listening to Margaret describe an idea she had been developing for years. A small, organic produce shop sourcing from local farms built on relationships Margaret already had from growing up in farming country. She had sketched layouts. She had estimated startup costs. She had thought about it more carefully than she had thought about almost anything in recent memory. Denise leaned forward with genuine interest. "That's the best idea I've heard all year, Maggie. You should do it." The following week, Margaret mentioned the idea to Douglas over dinner. He set down his fork and smiled at her with the patient expression of a man explaining something obvious to someone he was fond of. "We don't need the income, Maggie, and honestly, retail is brutal. I've seen it eat people alive. Who would manage the house? Who would handle the kids' schedules?" He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You already have the hardest job there is. Don't sell yourself short." She told Denise the next day. Denise listened. She did not argue with Douglas's logic. She did not defend Margaret's idea. She simply went quiet in a way that Margaret noticed but did not examine too carefully at the time. Denise was the kind of friend who heard everything and stood on no one's side, and there is a particular cost to that kind of neutrality that only becomes visible much later. The years accumulated. Claire grew up. Nathan grew up. Douglas's empire expanded. Properties across 3 counties. A portfolio of commercial leases, equity and development projects, a house they lived in for 28 years, a vacation property on a lake 2 hours north, retirement accounts that Margaret assumed were jointly held. She had no career of her own, no income in her name, no independent financial identity. She had poured everything into Douglas's world, and Douglas's world had thrived. But the truth she would only understand much later was that Douglas had never thought of their arrangement as a shared investment. He had thought of it as a transaction. She gave. He kept. There was a Christmas dinner at the Colton family home about 15 years before the end. Margaret had cooked the entire meal for 14 people. A turkey, 2 sides of roasted vegetables, homemade rolls, a pie. She had stayed up until midnight to finish. She had set the table with the good china, arranged the centerpiece, made sure every glass was filled before anyone had to ask. When she brought the main dish to the table, Douglas's mother, Vivian, 78 years old, pearl earrings, posture like a drawn blade, glanced at the turkey and said to Janet, Douglas's sister, in a voice precisely calibrated to be just audible enough, "It's quite good, actually, for someone who wasn't raised knowing how to do this sort of thing." Margaret heard. She pretended she did not. Douglas sat 3 chairs away. He either did not hear or chose not to. There was never any way to know which, and after a certain number of years, the distinction stopped mattering. Margaret washed the dishes alone at 11 o'clock that night. The house was quiet. Everyone had gone to bed or gone home satisfied. No one had offered to help. No one had said thank you. She stood at the sink with her hands in the warm water and looked out the window at the dark yard and thought about nothing in particular. Or rather, she thought about something so large and so diffuse that it did not have a name yet. It was the shape of her life. It was the recognition, not yet fully formed, that the architecture she had helped build had no room in it for her. She did not say anything about it. She never said anything about it. That was how the erosion worked. It was so gradual and so quiet that by the time you noticed the ground had shifted, you were already standing in a different landscape. The births of her children were the moments she returned to most often in the years that followed. Not because they were the happiest moments of her life, though they were close, but because of what they revealed about the man she had married. Claire was born on a Tuesday evening. Douglas arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after the delivery, coming directly from a client dinner he had not wanted to leave early. He held his daughter and cried and told Margaret she was amazing and she had forgiven him instantly because the tears seemed real and because she wanted them to be. Nathan was born on a Saturday morning. Douglas was on a golf weekend. Margaret had called him 3 times. The first call, he said he was on his way. The second call, he said traffic was bad. The third call, he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "I'm on the 14th hole, Maggie. Don't dramatize this." Nathan arrived 1 hour after Douglas finally walked through the door. Margaret never mentioned it again, but she never forgot it. There are certain sentences that embed themselves in the architecture of a marriage like load-bearing walls. You cannot remove them without the whole structure shifting. She simply learned to live around that sentence the way you learn to live around a door that does not close properly. You stop noticing it, you adjust your path. You tell yourself it is not important. She had not seen the signs of what was coming, or perhaps she had seen them and had called them something else. The increasing distance, the trips that stretched longer than necessary, the phone calls taken in other rooms with the door pulled shut, the careful way Douglas began referring to certain assets as my properties and my accounts in conversation, as though the shift in language were nothing more than habit. She attributed it to stress, to the pressures of managing a complex business. She had been wrong. Douglas had been restructuring everything for nearly a decade before he filed for divorce, moving assets into limited liability companies registered in his name alone, refinancing properties in ways that quietly removed her from the deeds. Every maneuver patient and methodical and invisible to a woman who had trusted her husband the way she trusted the ground beneath her feet. By the time he came home one evening and told Margaret, then 68, that he was in love with his assistant and wanted a divorce, the financial architecture he had built to exclude her was already essentially complete. She stood in the kitchen of 28 years, the same kitchen where she had washed dishes at midnight after cooking for 14. The same kitchen where she had fed her children breakfast every morning for 2 decades. And she felt the floor shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world. During the 16 months of proceedings that followed, Margaret learned the full scope of what had been done. Every legal avenue her attorney pursued hit a carefully constructed wall. Every asset she believed she was entitled to had been structured years in advance to be beyond her reach. She watched her life's work disappear on paper line by line, hearing by hearing, until even the attorney who had been fighting for her withdrew from the case when the retainer ran out. She was alone, truly alone. She had considered calling her brother Tom, not for money. She just needed someone to say the words, "You'll be all right," in a voice that meant it. Tom Bridwell had never been particularly warm, but he was family, and family was supposed to mean something when everything else had been stripped away. He answered on the 4th ring. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who already knew what this call was about and had decided he did not want to be involved. Maggie, I heard about the divorce. I just need to talk, Tom. I don't need anything from you. I just need someone to talk to. There was a pause. Then Tom said, "Listen, do you know anything about Dad's old land? Whether any of it is still in the family, I've been looking into selling the family share." Margaret blinked. "I thought Dad sold that place years ago. I watched him sign papers." "Right. Fine. Just checking." Another pause, shorter, already pulling away. "Look, I'm sorry about everything with Douglas. I really am. But don't drag me into it, all right? I've got my own situation." He hung up. Margaret sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after the call ended. She had lost her husband. She had lost her assets. She had lost her attorney. And now she knew with the particular clarity that only complete isolation can provide that her brother was not going to be the person who stood beside her. The courtroom on the second floor of the Harwick County Courthouse smelled of old wood and stale coffee on the morning of the final settlement hearing. It was late November, a gray, windswept Tuesday, the kind of day that felt designed for endings. Margaret arrived 13 minutes early. She took the elevator alone. The hallway was quiet except for her footsteps and the distant sound of a heating unit working too hard against the cold. She paused outside the double doors, her hand flat on the wood, her eyes closed. She was not praying. She was remembering. And what she remembered was not the marriage or the betrayal or the 16 months of legal destruction. She remembered the smell of coffee in their first apartment on Sunday mornings, the sound of Douglas's voice on a payphone, breathless with excitement about his first major deal. She remembered believing. That was the part that hurt the most. Not what he had done, but what she had believed. She opened the doors and walked in. Douglas was already seated at the defendant's table with Russell Keene, his attorney, a man of 56 with silver cufflinks and the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades winning in rooms like this one. Douglas looked well. He always looked well. 71 years old, but money had been generous to him. Good tailoring, careful grooming, a tan that suggested somewhere warm and recent. Beside him sat Brooke, his girlfriend, 31 years old, cream blouse, dark blazer. She had arranged herself in her chair with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew how this was going to end. The family had come to watch. Keith Douglas's brother sat in the second row with his arms folded and a small, satisfied expression he was not bothering to conceal. Janet Douglas's sister sat beside her husband, exchanging glances of anticipated satisfaction. And Vivian, 78, charcoal gray dress, pearl earrings, her posture immaculate, and her expression carrying that careful blankness she had used as a weapon for 41 years, sat at the center of the row as though presiding over a ceremony she had long expected. She had never accepted Margaret, not once in 4 decades. She had never said it directly because Vivian did not operate through direct statements. She operated through 1,000 quiet signals. The slight pause before including Margaret in family photographs. The way she addressed Douglas alone when discussing family matters. The way she had once at a gathering years ago referred to Margaret in a voice precisely calibrated for audibility as the woman Douglas settled for. Before the judge entered, Vivian rose from her seat and walked to the front of the courtroom. She passed Margaret's table. She stopped. She looked down at the burgundy blazer Margaret had bought herself 3 Christmases ago, the nicest piece of clothing she still owned, and she said, just loud enough for Margaret alone to hear, "At least you chose an appropriate color for a funeral." Then she turned and walked back to her seat. 41 years of a relationship summarized in a single sentence delivered at the precise volume of deniability. Judge Catherine Marsh entered at 9 o'clock. She was in her early 60s with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She carried herself with the manner of someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior a long time ago, but had not yet allowed herself to stop caring about outcomes. Case number 2025 DR 4412, Colton versus Colton. Final settlement hearing. Russell Keene rose. He adjusted his jacket. He walked to the center of the courtroom carrying a single sealed envelope and opened it with the unhurried confidence of a performance he had rehearsed. He looked across at Margaret, and his expression contained no hostility at all, which she had come to understand was more unsettling than hostility would have been. Your Honor, my client has been more than reasonable throughout these proceedings. He has extended every professional consideration to the plaintiff, despite her complete failure to contribute to the financial foundation of this marriage. After exhaustive review, he is prepared to make a final and complete settlement offer. He paused. The courtroom held its breath. My client offers the plaintiff $2. Silence, complete and total. Russell reached into the envelope and removed something small. He held it up between two fingers. A worn, faded $2 bill, old and clearly handled over many years, its paper soft, its edges rounded and frayed. Your Honor, this bill was pressed into my client's hand by the plaintiff's father, Walter Bridwell, at the couple's engagement dinner 42 years ago. Mr. Bridwell pushed it across the table and said, "And I have a witness statement confirming this. This is all I have to give you. Take care, my girl." My client kept it. He considered it a token of that evening. He now presents it as the most honest accounting of what the plaintiff's family ever brought to this union. $2. That is the complete and final value of what Margaret Bridwell contributed to 41 years of marriage. Keith laughed first, a short, satisfied bark. Then Janet, her hand covering her mouth, but her eyes bright with undisguised delight. Vivian did not laugh. Her lips simply curved, and the temperature in the room dropped by a degree that only Margaret could feel. Brooke leaned close to Douglas and whispered something that made him smile. Douglas stood. He walked to Margaret's table without hurrying, the walk of a man who was certain of every step he had ever taken. He placed the $2 bill directly in front of her and smoothed it flat against the wood with two fingers pressing down, slowly, deliberately, the way you might press a stamp into wax. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. 41 years between them in that single vertical distance. Your father always said this was all he had, Douglas said quietly. Turns out he was telling the truth. Margaret looked at the bill. She looked at the man she had loved for 41 years. She looked at the faces behind him. The brother who was grinning. The sister who could barely contain herself. The mother whose controlled satisfaction was worse than all of their open cruelty combined. The young woman in the cream blouse who had already claimed the life that used to be Margaret's. She reached for the bill. Her fingers were almost touching the worn paper. She was going to take it. She was going to sign the documents. She was going to walk out of this courtroom and never come back. She was going to let somebody let 41 years be worth exactly $2 because she had no energy left to fight and no one left willing to fight beside her. Then a hand closed gently but firmly over her wrist. She turned. Henry Garrett was sitting in the chair directly beside her. She had not seen him enter. She had not heard him move. He was in his early 70s, slight and unhurried, wearing a dark suit that had been pressed with extraordinary care. His face was calm, his posture was composed, but his hands were trembling. He had been Walter Bridwell's attorney for nearly 30 years. He had handled quiet things, lease reviews, a property dispute, the small and modest legal needs of a man that most people in the county had long since written off as nothing more than a simple farmer. He had no role in these proceedings. He had no right to be sitting at this table. But his eyes were fixed on the $2 bill lying on the polished wood in front of Margaret. And something in those eyes, something old and patient and certain, made Margaret pull her hand back without understanding why. Henry did not look at Douglas. He did not look at Russell Keene. He did not look at Keith or Janet or Vivian or the young woman in the cream blouse. He looked at Judge Catherine Marsh, and he said in a voice that was quiet and steady and carried the particular weight of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for 3 decades. "Your Honor, I respectfully request a 10-minute recess." The judge looked at him for a long moment. She had seen many things in many courtrooms. She had seen grief and anger and desperation and every variety of human damage that divorce proceedings can produce. But what she saw in Henry Garrett's face was none of those things. It was something rarer and more compelling than urgency. It was settled certainty, the absolute composure of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had known for a very long time. She granted the recess. Russell Keene objected immediately, his composure cracking at the edges. For the first time that morning, Douglas turned in his chair to look at Henry with an expression that was not quite worry. It was the thing that comes just before worry, the first small fracture in a wall that has never been tested. Henry did not acknowledge either of them. He simply placed his hand gently on Margaret's elbow and guided her to her feet and walked her out of the courtroom, down the hallway, and into a small conference room at the far end where the fluorescent light buzzed overhead and the window looked out onto the gray November parking lot below. He closed the door. He set his briefcase on the table, and he opened it with the unhurried movements of a man who had spent 30 years preparing for a moment that was finally here. He placed 3 things on the table. The first was a folded letter in Walter Bridwell's handwriting. The second was a heavy iron key on a plain metal ring. The third was a photograph, slightly faded, of a farmhouse at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by fields that stretched to a tree line in the distance, taken on a bright summer morning sometime in the late 1980s. Margaret looked at the photograph. She looked at Henry. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "That's my father's farm. He sold that place years ago. I watched him sign the papers." Henry shook his head slowly. "He didn't sell it, Margaret. He transferred it into a trust in your name. And what is on that farm, what your father spent his entire life building there, is something that Douglas Colton's lawyers are never going to find a way to touch." Margaret stared at him. The fluorescent light hummed. The November wind pressed against the window. "What do you mean, what's on the farm?" Henry stood. He picked up the iron key. He reached into his pocket for his car keys with the other hand. And he looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not pity, not triumph. Something closer to the way a man looks when a promise he made a very long time ago is finally ready to be kept. "I can't explain it to you, Margaret. You have to see it for yourself." The conference room at the end of the hallway smelled of cleaning solution and recycled air, and the fluorescent tube above them had developed a faint flicker that pulsed at the edge of Margaret's vision like a second heartbeat. Henry Garrett stood across the table from her with the iron key still in his hand, and Margaret realized that she had not taken a full breath since he had spoken the words, "You have to see it for yourself." She did not move. She looked at the 3 objects on the table: the letter in her father's handwriting, the key, the photograph of a farmhouse she had believed was sold and gone, and part of a past that no longer existed in any form she could touch. "Henry," she said, "we can't just leave. The judge is waiting. The settlement." "We're going back in," Henry said, "right now. But first you need to understand something." He sat down across from her and placed his hands flat on the table, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw the full weight of what he had been carrying. Not exhaustion, something closer to the particular tension of a man who has held a secret for so long that the act of finally releasing it requires his own kind of courage. You need to accept the $2, Margaret. She stared at him. You need to accept it formally, on the record, in front of the judge. You need that bill signed over to you, documented, legal, permanent. Why? Because Douglas doesn't know what it is. Henry leaned forward. He kept it for 42 years as a trophy, a reminder of the night he decided your father was nothing. He carried it in his breast pocket like a monument to his own superiority, and in all that time he never once turned it over. He never once looked closely at what else was written there. Margaret felt something shift in her understanding, a door opening in a wall she had believed was solid. My father wrote on it, the night of your engagement dinner, after Douglas's family had gone home, after your father had driven back to the farmhouse alone and sat down at his kitchen table and thought very carefully about the kind of people he had just watched his daughter join. He took that bill, Margaret, the same one Douglas had pressed into his hand like a man tipping a parking attendant, and he wrote on it in pencil, in the lower margin, coordinates, a combination, and one sentence. What sentence? Henry shook his head slowly. You'll see it when we get there, but first, the courtroom. We need that bill in your hands officially before we do anything else. You're telling me that Douglas Colton has been carrying the key to something my father built in his own pocket for 42 years, and he never knew. Henry allowed himself a small, careful smile, the first she had seen from him. Your father understood something about men like Douglas that most people never figure out. He understood that arrogance is its own kind of faithfulness. A man like that will guard his trophies forever. He will protect them and preserve them and keep them close because they are proof of his own dominance. Your father knew that the safest place in the world to hide something was inside the pride of a man who would never think to question what he was carrying. They returned to the courtroom. The recess had lasted 8 minutes. Russell Keene was standing near the defendant's table with his arms crossed, speaking to Douglas in a voice too low to carry. Keith had stopped smiling. Vivian sat with her handbag in her lap and her eyes tracking Henry and Margaret as they came through the doors with the careful attention of a woman who had not survived 78 years without developing an instinct for when something in a room had changed. Judge Marsh reconvened the hearing. Mrs. Colton, she said, looking directly at Margaret, having had the opportunity to consult with counsel, do you have a response to the settlement offer currently before the court? Margaret stood. Henry stood beside her. Your Honor, Margaret said, and her voice was steady and clear, in a way that surprised even her, as though some part of her that had been compressed for decades had suddenly found room to expand. I accept the $2 settlement. The reaction from Douglas's side of the courtroom was immediate and unrestrained. Keith clapped once, a sharp sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Janet covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were bright with undisguised delight. Brooke leaned close to Douglas and said something quiet, and he laughed. A short, satisfied sound that carried across the room like a verdict he had been waiting to hear. Vivian uncrossed and recrossed her ankles with the composure of a woman receiving precisely the news she had come to receive. Russell Keene moved efficiently, producing settlement documents from his briefcase with a smoothness that confirmed he had prepared them well in advance. Margaret signed each page where indicated. Her handwriting was careful and deliberate, and she did not rush because she understood now that what she was signing was not a surrender. It was a transfer. She was accepting something Douglas believed was worthless, and she was going to let him believe that for as long as it took to get out of this room. When the final signature was recorded and the judge had spoken the words that made it legal and permanent, Russell Keene picked up the $2 bill from the table and held it out to Margaret with polished courtesy. Your settlement, he said. Margaret took it from him. She held it in both hands for just a moment. She did not look at it. She folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of her burgundy blazer close to her chest. She looked at Douglas one last time across the courtroom. He was already turning away. "Thank you," she said to no one in particular and to everyone at once. Outside the courthouse, the November air hit her face and she felt something she had not felt in 16 months. Clarity. Not happiness, not relief, but the sharp and simple clarity of a woman who has been told there is a door and is walking toward it without yet knowing what is on the other side. Henry's car was a dark green sedan, well-maintained, the kind of vehicle that announces nothing about its owner except patience. He opened the passenger door for her. She sat down. He walked around and got behind the wheel but did not immediately start the engine. "Before we go," he said, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket, "there is something your father wanted you to have at this specific moment. Not later. Now." He placed a small envelope on the console between them. Her name was written on the front in Walter Bridwell's careful hand. Not Margaret Colton, Margaret Bridwell, her name. Her own name, the one she had been born with, the one that belonged to her before she had given any part of herself to anyone. She opened it. Inside was a single index card, 4 words in pencil in her father's meticulous printing. "Drive with me, come home." She pressed her fingers to her mouth and closed her eyes, and for a long moment the only sound in the car was the November wind against the windows and the far-off sound of a train somewhere south of town. Henry started the engine. They drove south out of Harwick County on the state highway for 20 minutes. Henry did not speak, and Margaret did not ask him to. She watched the landscape change through the window. The strip malls and gas stations giving way to open fields, the sky widening as the road narrowed, the world becoming quieter and emptier and older with every mile. Henry turned onto a county road, then a smaller road, then a gravel lane that Margaret recognized with the force of something physical, as though the landscape had reached through the window and taken hold of her. The oak tree was still there, massive and familiar, its bare November branches spreading against the gray sky in a pattern she could have drawn from memory. The porch was still there, its boards weathered, gray but solid, the railing she had leaned against as a child still holding its shape after all these decades. The fields stretched out on both sides of the lane, dormant in the cold but clearly tended. The fences were intact, the drainage channels were clear. The soil along the edges was dark and recently turned. "Someone has been maintaining this," Margaret said slowly. "For 30 years, Henry said. Your father made arrangements. After he passed, the trust continued the work. There are 2 people who have worked this land since before your father died. They are still here. They knew this day would come." He stopped the car at the end of the lane. The engine went quiet, and the silence of the place came in through the windows. It was not true silence. It was the particular texture of rural quiet made up of wind and distance and living things going about their business without any reference to human trouble. The front door of the farmhouse opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was about 60, weathered and lean, wearing a faded flannel shirt with soil on his hands and forearms. He stood with his weight balanced evenly, his eyes moving from Henry to Margaret and staying on Margaret with an expression that was not hostile but was very far from welcoming. Ray Whitfield. Margaret had never met him, but he looked at her as though he had been forming an opinion about her for 22 years and had not yet decided whether she deserved what he was about to show her. "So today's the day," Ray said to Henry. Henry nodded. "Today." Ray looked at Margaret. He took his time. He studied her blazer, her shoes, her hands, her face. He was reading her the way a man reads weather or soil, looking for what was underneath the surface, looking for what was real. "I've worked this land for 22 years, he said. "Walter hired me. Walter trusted me. I don't know you, Mrs. Colton. I know this ground, and I know what Walter built on it." He paused. "There's something else you should know. About 2 months ago, a man came around asking questions about this property. Said he represented a buyer. I didn't tell him anything, but someone is looking. Margaret felt a cold thread pull through her chest. Douglas already, or someone else. She filed the question away without answering it and turned toward the farmhouse, toward the structure she could see behind it. In the near distance, a large timber frame building with its doors closed against the season. "I'm ready," she said. The building was larger than it appeared from the lane. Up close, the craftsmanship was unmistakable. This was not a structure thrown together for utility. It had been built with the kind of precise intention that takes years and a very specific vision. The timber framing was solid oak fitted and joined by hands that understood wood the way a musician understands an instrument. The roof was steel, clearly replaced within the last decade. The foundation was poured concrete deep and level, the kind that does not move with frost. Margaret inserted the iron key. The lock turned cleanly and the door swung inward on balanced hinges without resistance. The first thing that reached her was the smell, dry and complex and layered. Earth and timber and something green and alive underneath a botanical richness that should not have existed in a sealed structure on a cold November morning. She stepped inside and the scope of what her father had built opened up around her in the dim light. The interior was divided into 3 sections. The nearest held floor-to-ceiling shelving units made from the same careful joinery as the building itself. On the shelves were hundreds of sealed glass containers, jars of varying sizes, each one labeled in Walter Bridwell's handwriting in a system of letters and numbers she could not yet decode. Beside the shelves stood a row of flat wooden drawers, the kind used in seed libraries, each one labeled and dated. Margaret pulled one open slowly. Inside, sorted into individual paper envelopes, were seeds. Hundreds of them. Each envelope marked with a name, a date, a location of origin. The second section had a higher ceiling, fitted with a ventilation system of obvious sophistication. Not something cobbled together from hardware store parts, but an engineered network with multiple intake and exhaust points, humidity sensors, temperature gauges mounted at intervals along the walls. Along one side ran a long workbench covered with journals. Dozens of identical dark green notebooks stacked in careful rows dated on their spines in chronological order, beginning in 1974 and running through the year of Walter's death. She opened one at random. Every page was filled with her father's precise handwriting, observations, measurements, diagrams, notes on soil composition, on cross-pollination results, on the behavior of specific plant varieties across specific seasons on this specific piece of land. 40 years of a man's inner life documented with the same attention he brought to everything he touched. The third section held the lockbox. Set into the concrete floor beneath a hinged wooden panel that Margaret found only because Henry showed her where to look. Fireproof steel, combination lock. She took the $2 bill from her blazer pocket and unfolded it. She turned it over, and there in the lower margin in pencil, so faint she had to hold it close to her eyes, were numbers, written in her father's hand. His sevens crossed in the European style he had never abandoned. His eights formed in 2 careful circles, stacked one on the other. She looked at those numbers and understood with a force that nearly buckled her knees. Douglas Colton had carried this bill in his breast pocket for 42 years. He had kept it close to his heart as a symbol of everything he believed about her father and about her. And the entire time, it had been carrying coordinates and a combination and a sentence that Douglas had never bothered to read, because he had never imagined that a farmer he considered beneath his notice could possibly have anything worth saying. She dialed the combination, The lock released with a clean mechanical sound that echoed in the quiet building. Inside the box was a leather folder. On top of it, a letter. Pale blue stationery she recognized immediately. Her father had used the same paper for as long as she could remember. His handwriting was steady and clear, with none of the tremor that illness had brought in his final months. He had written this early. He had written this while he was still strong. Margaret read it aloud. Henry stood behind her in the quiet of the building and listened. My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then the moment I spent 30 years preparing for has arrived, and I want you to know something before you open that folder. Everything in this building, everything I built and documented and protected was built for you, not as a safety net, not as a rescue, and as a statement, and as proof that I always knew what you were worth even when the people around you did not. She paused. Her voice had not broken, but it had changed. It had become quieter, more careful, as though the words she was reading required a different kind of breath. When I came to this land, I was a farmer's son, with a borrowed truck and soil under my fingernails that I couldn't get entirely clean no matter how long I scrubbed. People made assumptions about me based on those things, and I let them, because I had learned early that an invisible man can build things that a visible man cannot. I spent 50 years on this land, watching, experimenting, recording, creating. What I discovered, I documented. What I documented, I protected. In this folder, you will find patents for 23 plant varieties I developed over the course of my life on this farm. Drought-resistant strains of crops that grow reliably in soil types most agricultural scientists have written off as too depleted to support viable yields. 3 of them have already been licensed to agricultural companies operating across the Midwest and the South. The licensing agreements are structured to pay royalties to the trust, your trust, for the remaining life of each patent. The farm itself holds the only existing seed bank for 11 of these varieties. This means that the land you are standing on is not just sentimentally valuable, it is scientifically irreplaceable. Margaret lowered the letter for a moment. She looked around the building, at the shelves, at the boxerin, at the drawers full of seeds, at 40 years of green notebooks. Her father had been here, in this room, alone for decades, working in silence while the world walked past and saw nothing worth examining. She raised the letter again. I want to tell you about that $2 bill. When Douglas pressed it into my hand at your engagement dinner, I smiled and I thanked him. Then I drove home and sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. I thought about the kind of man who would do that and the kind of family that raised him. And I made myself a promise. I took a pencil and I wrote on that bill, very carefully, the coordinates of this farm, the combination to the box you just opened, and one sentence. Margaret turned the $2 bill over again. She looked at the margin below the numbers. And there in pencil, so faint it was almost invisible in Walter Bridwell's careful printing, was a single line she had missed the first time. She was always the best of us. She read it twice, she read it 3 times, then she could not read it anymore because she could not see. She continued with the letter, her voice uneven now. I knew Douglas would keep it. Men like that always keep their trophies. And I knew that someday he would use it to hurt you. That the moment he handed it to you would be the moment it became yours. I planned for that day, Margaret, the way a farmer plans for a season that hasn't come yet, with patience and with faith and with a great deal of quiet work in the meantime. The current valuation of the trust assets as of the last independent assessment conducted 18 months ago is $9.4 million. With continuing royalties and ongoing licensing negotiations for the 3 newest varieties, that number is expected to grow substantially. Every cent of it is legally and completely yours. No court on earth can reach it. I made certain of that. You were never worth $2, Margaret. You were never worth the small opinion that small people had of you or of me. You were always worth everything. I just needed you to arrive at the place where you could receive it. I love you more than I ever managed to say properly. I always meant to get better at saying it. Your father, Walter Bridwell. Margaret lowered the letter. She sat down on the concrete floor of the building her father had built with his own hands over 5 patient years. She put her face in her hands, and she wept in a way she had not wept in decades. Not from grief alone, from something much larger and much older than grief, from the overwhelming and disorienting experience of being seen completely by someone who had known all along exactly who she was and had spent an entire lifetime making sure that knowledge was protected and preserved and waiting for her. Henry Garrett sat down in a wooden chair near the workbench. He said nothing. He had waited 30 years. He was content to let this moment be whatever it needed to be. After a while, Margaret stood. She wiped her face. She opened the leather folder. She began to read. 23 patents, 11 irreplaceable seed varieties, licensing agreements generating ongoing royalties. A trust structured before her marriage, connected to no transaction Douglas had ever been part of, entirely beyond the reach of any legal argument his attorneys could construct. Her father, the quiet farmer everyone had looked through without seeing, had built her a fortress, out of seeds and patience and love. They drove back toward town as the November light was beginning to fade. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, holding the leather folder in her lap and the $2 bill in her hand, looking out at the passing fields, and she did not speak for a long time. It was Henry who finally broke the silence. Margaret, there is something I did not tell you yet, about the day your father wrote on that bill. She looked at him. After he finished writing the coordinates and the combination, he sat at that kitchen table for another hour. He told me this himself years later. He said he sat there thinking about whether it was enough, whether the numbers alone would be enough, and he decided they were not. He decided that if his daughter was ever going to find what he had built, she needed to find it not just with a combination and a set of coordinates, but with a sentence that told her why it existed. A sentence that she would read at the worst moment of her life and understand that someone had seen her clearly the entire time. Margaret looked down at the bill, at the pencil marks in the margin, at the 5 words her father had written 42 years ago in the kitchen of a farmhouse on a gravel road alone, after watching his daughter pledge her life to a man who had tipped him $2. She was always the best of us. Henry pulled into the farmhouse lane and parked. The oak tree stood dark against the last gray light. The porch light was on. Ray Whitfield had turned it on before they left for the courthouse, which meant he had known they would be coming back, which meant Walter had told him years ago how this day would end. Margaret opened the car door and stepped out onto the gravel. The cold came around her. She walked into the farmhouse, into the bedroom that had been hers as a child. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the last of the daylight and held the $2 bill and breathed. And then it was dark, and the house was quiet, and Margaret was 69 years old alone on a farm at the end of a gravel road, and everything she thought she knew about her life had been replaced in the space of a single afternoon by something she did not yet have the language to describe. The wind came through the gaps in the old window frame and moved across her face. Her knees ached from walking on uneven ground all day. Her lower back had stiffened during the drive. Her body was reminding her with the blunt honesty that bodies reserve for people who have stopped being young that she was not 30. She was not 50. She was 69 and she was starting over, and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be was measured not just in decisions, but in the physical reality of aging, in joints that protested, and muscles that tired earlier than they used to, and a stamina that had to be carefully managed rather than assumed. She thought about what Ray had said, that someone had been asking about the property, that someone was looking. Douglas already. He had watched her accept $2 and walk out of a courtroom with nothing. Why would he be looking? Unless he suspected. Unless something Denise had told him had planted a seed. Margaret sat up in the dark. She reached for her phone on the nightstand. There was a missed call from Denise Pruitt and a voicemail. She played it. Maggie, I need to tell you something. Douglas came to my house yesterday. He was asking about your father, about the land, about anything you might be hiding. A long pause, the sound of Denise breathing. I told him about the produce shop idea, and I told him you always said your father was smarter than people gave him credit for. I didn't think it mattered, Maggie. I didn't think any of it was important. I'm sorry. Margaret set the phone down. She stared at the ceiling. The woman she had considered her closest friend for 15 years had handed Douglas a thread to pull. Not a map, not directions, but enough to start him looking. She thought about calling Henry. She thought about calling the police, though she had no idea what she would report. She thought about driving back to the city and confronting Denise, though she had nothing left in her that wanted to confront anyone about anything. Instead, she lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the dark ceiling and felt the full weight of what her life had become. $9.4 million in a trust she had not known existed that morning. A farm full of her father's life's work, and the growing certainty that Douglas Colton, who had spent 42 years underestimating her and her father, was not going to stop now. He was going to come looking, and she was going to have to be ready. But was she the person her father had believed she was, the woman described in those 5 pencil words? She had spent 41 years being erased, and she had not fought it. She had not even recognized it was happening until it was over. What kind of person allows that? The wind pushed against the old window. Somewhere outside, an owl called once and did not call again. The farmhouse settled around her with the sounds old buildings make at night, the particular vocabulary of wood and age and weather that she had known as a child and had forgotten for 4 decades. She reached for the nightstand where she had placed the journal Ray had shown her that afternoon. One of the later volumes. She had opened it briefly before the light failed, and a single entry had caught her eye, dated the week of her wedding. Walter had noted the event in his usual precise manner. No commentary, no opinion, just the fact recorded alongside observations about germination rates and soil conditions. And then beneath it, a single line. The soil here is good. I will keep working it. He had not written, my daughter is making a mistake. He had not written, I am disappointed. He had written, I will keep working. That was Walter Bridwell. That was who he was. He did not judge. He did not intervene. He prepared. He built. He worked quietly for 30 years, not because he believed things would go wrong, but because he understood that love means building for every possibility, including the ones you hope will never arrive. Margaret sat up in the dark. She reached for the first journal, the one dated 1974. She could not read it in this light, but she held it in her hands and felt its weight. Tomorrow morning she would begin. She would start from the first page and read forward through 50 years of her father's mind. She would learn the language of his work. She would understand what he had built and why. And she would decide not based on Douglas's opinion of her, or Vivian's opinion of her, or Tom's indifference, or Denise's betrayal, but based on evidence whether she was the woman Walter Bridwell had spent his whole life believing she could become. That was the moment it began, not in the courtroom, not in the conference room with the iron key, not even in the timber building with the seeds and the journals and the letter. It began here in a narrow bed in a cold room at 69 years old, with aching knees and a broken friendship and a father's journal in her hands, in the moment she decided to stop being the woman Douglas Colton had made her and start discovering the woman Walter Bridwell had always known was there. Margaret Colton spent the winter reading, not the way she had read during her marriage, which was in stolen half hours between obligations, a chapter here, a paragraph there, always with one ear turned toward a door that might open and require her attention. She read the way her father had worked, slowly, completely, without apology. She began with the first journal dated 1974 and moved forward. She sat in the farmhouse kitchen each evening with the green notebook open on the table and a pencil in her hand, marking the margins with questions and drawing lines between entries that seemed to connect across years and decades. Walter Bridwell had not written for an audience. He had written for himself and for the work, and the result was a record of extraordinary precision and patience. Germination rates documented across 30 consecutive growing seasons. Cross-pollination experiments tracked over 15 years before a single conclusion was drawn. Soil composition analyses that filled entire notebooks with data points so granular they read like the inner monologue of a man having a very long and very serious conversation with the earth itself. She found herself in those pages in ways she had not expected. Her father had recorded the milestones of her life alongside the milestones of his crops, with a matter-of-fact tenderness that was entirely characteristic of a man who expressed love through attention rather than language. Her first day of school appeared in the same entry as notes on an early barley strain. Her graduation beside observations about a successful growing season. Small facts about her life placed next to small facts about his work, as though the two were branches of the same living system, which she understood now they were. In the morning, she walked the fields with a cup of coffee. At first, she stayed on the paths that Ray Whitfield had maintained, the packed dirt trails between sections, where the soil was firm enough for her knees. But as the weeks passed, she found herself stepping off the trails, kneeling at the edges of the dormant rows, pressing her fingers into the cold ground, and comparing what she felt with what her father had described. The journals were becoming a language she could read. The farm was becoming a language she could feel. Ray watched. He did not comment. He did not offer help. He simply continued his work with the steady rhythm of a man who has been doing the same thing for 2 decades and sees no reason to change his pace for anyone. But one morning in late January, Margaret knelt at the eastern edge of the barley field with a journal open beside her, comparing the soil color with a diagram Walter had drawn in 1991. And when she stood up, there was a pair of worn leather work gloves on the porch railing that had not been there when she left the house. They were Walter's gloves. She recognized the shape of them, the way the leather had been softened by years of use into the specific contours of her father's hands. Ray had kept them, and he had placed them where she would find them without being told what they meant. She put them on. They were too large, but they were warm and they smelled of soil and leather and something she could not name that belonged to a specific time and place in her memory. She wore them every morning after that. February became March. The fields began to show the first signs of the season turning. Margaret had finished the journals through 1989 and had begun to understand the shape of what her father had been doing, not just as science, but as philosophy. Walter Bridwell had spent 50 years asking a single question: what can this land produce that no one believes it can? And he had answered it 23 times in 23 varieties that defied what the agricultural establishment had declared impossible. She was sitting on the porch on a Tuesday morning when Henry Garrett's sedan came up the gravel lane faster than she had ever seen him drive. He parked at an angle which was unlike him. He got out without closing the driver's door, which was unlike him. He walked to the porch steps and looked up at her with an expression she had not seen before, something between alarm and the very controlled anger of a man who does not allow himself to be angry often, but has found a reason. Douglas filed a land use complaint with the county, he said, yesterday afternoon through a third party, but I traced it back to his office. He's claiming this property is operating as an unlicensed commercial research facility. He's requesting a formal inspection. Margaret set down her coffee. He doesn't need to win, Henry continued. He just needs an inspector inside that building asking questions. He just needs the complaint on file, creating a public record, drawing attention. He's not trying to take the trust. He knows he can't. He's trying to make noise. He's trying to make this difficult enough and visible enough that you'll offer him something to go away. Margaret looked out at the fields. The barley was beginning to push through the soil in the eastern rows, pale green shoots emerging from ground that looked too cold and too hard to support anything. She thought about her father sitting at this same porch 30 years ago, watching the same fields, knowing that someday the work he was doing in silence would be challenged by someone who understood nothing about it. What do we need? She asked. We need the agricultural permits your father filed. They're in the trust documentation, but they need to be presented in person at the county office. Someone needs to walk in there with the paperwork and make the case that this property has been operating within its zoning classification since before Douglas Colton ever heard the name Bridwell. Can you do it? Henry paused. He took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, and Margaret understood that the pause was not uncertainty, it was something else. It was the recognition that this particular task belonged to someone specific, and it was not him. I can file the paperwork, he said, but the complaint names you as the property owner. The county clerk is going to want to see you. They're going to want to hear from the person whose name is on the trust, not her attorney, her. Margaret had not driven anywhere alone since moving to the farm. She had not walked into any official building and stated her name and made a case for anything since the day she walked out of the Harwick County Courthouse with a $2 bill in her pocket. The prospect of doing it now alone without Henry beside her produced a sensation in her chest that was not quite fear. It was closer to the feeling you get at the edge of a high diving board when you have already committed to jumping, and the only remaining question is whether you will jump gracefully or badly. She drove herself to the county administrative building the following morning. The folder of documentation weighed 11 pounds. She carried it in both arms across the parking lot, through the front doors, and up a flight of stairs to the zoning office, where a clerk with reading glasses and a patient expression looked at her over a counter stacked with filing trays and asked how he could help. My name is Margaret Bridwell, she said. I own a farm on County Road 14. A complaint has been filed against the property, and I'm here to show you that every permit my father filed for that land, going back more than 40 years, is in order. She opened the folder. She laid out the documents one by one: agricultural zoning applications, soil conservation compliance forms, a research exemption filed in 1986 that Walter had obtained from the State Agricultural Board, allowing him to conduct experimental planning on his own property for non-commercial purposes. Every form filled out in Walter's handwriting. Every date verified. Every signature witnessed by Henry Garrett. The clerk reviewed the documents for 45 minutes. Margaret stood at the counter the entire time. Her back ached. Her hands were shaking in a way she hoped was not visible. But she did not sit down and she did not look away, because she understood that this was the thing she had never done during her marriage. She had never stood in a room and said in a voice that expected to be heard, "This is mine and it is real and you cannot take it." The complaint was dismissed that afternoon. insufficient grounds. The property was in full compliance and had been for decades. Margaret drove back to the farm and parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a long time. She had just fought for herself, not through Henry, not through a lawyer, not through a husband who was supposed to protect her interests, and had instead spent a decade quietly dismantling them. She had walked into a room and stated her name and presented evidence and won. Her hands were still shaking, but the shaking had changed. It was no longer the tremor of fear. It was the vibration of something that had been still for 41 years beginning to move. When she stepped out of the car, Ray Whitfield was standing on the porch. He had his hands in his pockets. He looked at her and nodded once, a single slow, deliberate nod. Then he turned and walked back inside. It was the smallest gesture, but Margaret understood it perfectly. She had passed his test, not the test of ownership or legal documentation. The test of whether she would stand on this ground and defend it. The test of whether she was Walter's daughter in action, not just in name. Spring arrived. Douglas's legal challenges continued and failed. The first motion challenging the trust had been dismissed in 11 days. The ruling was 3 sentences long. He hired a larger firm from the city. They reviewed the documentation for 4 weeks and came back with the same conclusion Henry had reached in a single phone call. The trust was sound. The patents were valid. The farm belonged to Margaret without condition. Douglas did not accept this gracefully, but the details of his refusal were becoming, for Margaret, increasingly distant. She was aware of them the way you are aware of weather in a town you no longer live in. Relevant, perhaps, in a general sense, but no longer personal. What was personal was the work, the trust, the future of what Walter had built. She consulted with Henry with scientists from the state university who had been contacted about Walter's seed collection and with a trust attorney who specialized in philanthropic structures. What emerged was a plan that felt less designed than uncovered. The shape of it had been waiting in the work Walter had already done. Margaret just had to recognize it. She established the Walter Bridwell Agricultural Trust. Its primary function was the preservation and ethical stewardship of the seed varieties Walter had developed, ensuring that the 11 strains held only in the farm's seed library would be maintained and made available to small-scale farmers and researchers working in regions where conventional agriculture was failing. The trust also provided grants to first-generation farmers and rural inventors who lacked resources to protect their own innovations. It was in early June that Tom Bridwell drove up the gravel lane unannounced. Margaret was in the kitchen. She heard the truck before she saw it, a heavy diesel sound that did not belong to Ray's vehicle or Henry's sedan. She went to the window and watched her brother step out of a truck she did not recognize, slam the door with more force than was necessary, and walk toward the farmhouse with the rigid posture of a man who had been composing an argument in his head for the entire drive. She met him on the porch. "I heard," Tom said without greeting. "I heard from people in town. Dad left you close to $10 million and I didn't get a cent. Is that true?" "It's true. I'm his son Maggie. I'm his firstborn. How is that fair?" Margaret looked at her brother. He was older than she was by 3 years. He had the same eyes as their father, the same strong hands, but none of the patience. Tom had been given land by Walter when he was 25. Good land, productive land. He had sold it within 2 years and used the money to buy a truck and fund a business that failed within 18 months. Walter had never spoken about it directly. He had simply noted it and adjusted his plans accordingly. "You sold the land Dad gave you, Tom, in 2 years. You took what he built and you turned it into something temporary. So he punishes me for one decision I made at 25 for the rest of my life." "He didn't punish you." Margaret's voice was quiet, but it held no apology. He protected what he built from anyone who wouldn't protect it. You can be angry about that, but you knew Dad Tom. You know he was right. Tom stood on the porch breathing hard. Then he walked into the timber building because the door was open and because he needed to see. He stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, looking at the shelves and the journals and the ventilation system and the decades of meticulous labor that filled every surface. He was seeing for the first time the full scale of what their father had accomplished in silence, while the world looked elsewhere. His expression changed. The anger drained out of it, and what replaced it was something more complicated and more painful. It was the look of a man recognizing that the person he had dismissed as simple had been extraordinary, and that his own failure to see it was not his father's fault. He left without saying anything more. Margaret watched his truck disappear down the gravel lane and felt something that was not quite sadness and not quite relief. It was the recognition that some relationships cannot be repaired by a single conversation, and that some silences carry more weight than words. 2 weeks later, she received a postcard. No return address, but the handwriting was Tom's. It said, "I remember the way the grass smelled at the farm early in the morning. I forgot that smell." Margaret placed it on the kitchen shelf beside the window. It was not an apology, but it was a door left slightly open, and she was content to let it stay that way. The news about Douglas moved through Harwick County with the quiet persistence of a true thing that people feel compelled to repeat. Within weeks of the hearing, the broad outline was known. Within months, the details had spread. And the details were damaging in a way that no legal filing or business setback could match, because they operated through the informal channels of reputation where there is no appeals process and no defense. The image had attached itself to his name permanently. A 71-year-old man sliding $2 across the table toward the woman who had given him 4 decades while his family laughed. Professional associates found it difficult to set aside. A client who did not return a call. A partner who seemed less available. A deal that moved forward without him. Claire had called Douglas the evening of the hearing, her voice controlled with visible effort, and told him she needed time. Nathan had not called at all. Messages went unanswered for weeks, then months. Brooke had moved out by spring, redistributing her presence in the apartment gradually until one day she was simply gone. Vivian called Douglas on a Sunday in March and told him in her composed way that she thought he had handled the situation poorly from a strategic standpoint. Douglas told her he did not want to discuss it. Vivian said, "I imagine not." 3 flat words, and something in the flatness stayed with him in a way he could not shake. In June, Dr. Ellen Calloway came to the farm. She was the chair of the plant genetics division at the state university, and she had spent her career working on food security in drought-affected regions. She had been contacted about Walter's seed collection by a colleague who had heard about the trust. She came expecting something modest. She stayed for 3 days. On the 3rd afternoon, she sat across the kitchen table from Margaret and set down the journal she had been reading, the one from 1997, and removed her glasses and pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Bridwell, I have spent 20 years working in this field. I have visited research institutions on 4 continents. And what your father built in that building without funding, without a university, without a single peer review, is one of the most significant private contributions to drought-resistant agriculture I have encountered in my entire career. 3 of his varieties demonstrate yield rates in depleted soil that exceed anything commercially available by margins that are going to change how we think about farming in arid regions." His work anticipated findings that institutional teams arrived at decades later with exponentially greater resources. Margaret nodded. She was not surprised. She had spent the winter reading Walter's journals, and she had understood gradually and then completely that her father had not been a farmer who dabbled in science. He had been a scientist who happened to farm. His name needs to be in the literature, Dr. Calloway said. The scientific community needs to know about this work. Then let's make sure it is. Ray Whitfield was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had been listening. When Dr. Calloway left, he stepped inside and set a cup of coffee on the table in front of Margaret. He had never done that before. In 6 months of living on the farm, he had never once made her a cup of coffee or performed any gesture that acknowledged her as anything other than a temporary presence he was tolerating. Walter would have liked her, Ray said, meaning Dr. Calloway. Then he paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Quieter, more careful. He would have liked seeing you here too, Mrs. Bridwell. It was the first time he had called her by her maiden name. Margaret looked up at him and understood that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not with speeches or declarations, but in the way that trust actually builds between people who are serious about the ground they stand on. One small gesture at a time, one cup of coffee. Claire came to the farm on a Saturday in December, 3 weeks after the hearing. She stood in the doorway of the timber building and looked at the shelves and the journals and the space her grandfather had built, and she was quiet for a long time. I never knew him, she said finally. Not really. I thought I did, but I only knew the surface. Most people did, Margaret said. He preferred it that way. Claire came again in the spring and brought her children. Her eldest daughter, 11 years old, walked through the timber building with the careful attention of a child who understands instinctively that she is standing inside something important. She asked questions about the seed drawers. She listened to the answers with a focused stillness that made Margaret's chest ache with recognition, because she had seen that same stillness in her father, and she was seeing it now in a girl who had never met him. Nathan drove out on a Sunday morning in September. Margaret was sitting on the porch reading the advance copy of the first published paper, Dr. Calloway's covering letter, folded in her lap. He sat down beside her and she handed him the paper without speaking. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. Grandpa figured this out in a field, he said. No funding, no team, no recognition. Margaret looked at the fields beyond the porch. The barley Walter had developed was moving in a light September wind, green and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to the judgments of people who had never understood what they were looking at. Your grandfather wasn't working for their recognition, she said. He was working for something that would outlast their opinion of him. That's a completely different motivation, and it produces completely different results. Nathan looked at the fields. He looked at the paper in his hands. He looked at his mother on the porch of the farmhouse his grandfather had built and left for her in the only way he knew how. I want to be involved, he said, with the trust. With whatever comes next, I want to help. Margaret smiled. It was a full smile, unhurried, the kind that had been coming more easily since November. Your grandfather would have liked that. He always said the work isn't finished until someone carries it forward. 2 years after the morning in the Harwick County Courthouse, Margaret drove herself to the cemetery on a clear October afternoon. She brought a bunch of late-season wildflowers from the mom's eastern field and a copy of the most recent annual report from the Walter Bridwell Agricultural Trust folded in her coat pocket. The drive took 18 minutes. She had made it many times, sometimes with purpose, and sometimes simply because she wanted to be near the place where her father's name was carved into stone and the world was quiet enough to think clearly. She parked at the gate and walked the familiar path between the older headstones to the modest granite marker Walter had paid for himself characteristically years before he needed it. She placed the wildflowers at the base. She sat down on the grass without caring about the cold or the damp. She unfolded the annual report across her knees. The numbers were different from the ones she had found in the lockbox. They were larger. The 3 licensing agreements already in place had generated steady royalties, and 2 new agreements had been signed in the preceding 12 months, with agricultural companies operating in regions where drought had made Walter's varieties not merely interesting, but urgent. The farm was now a working research site formerly partnered with the state university, visited by researchers from 3 other institutions and 2 international organizations. Dr. Calloway's second paper had been cited 14 times in 6 months. She told her father about all of it. She talked the way people talk to the dead when they are alone and the afternoon is clear and they have stopped caring whether they appear composed. She told him about the trust and the researchers and the papers, about Nathan who had taken a formal role in the grant program and was proving to be quietly and seriously good at the work, about Claire who had brought her children to the farm twice, and about the 11-year-old girl who had asked about the seed drawers with an attention that carried something forward from a man she would never meet. She told him about Douglas, not because she had been tracking his circumstances or because his situation occupied any significant portion of her attention, but because she thought her father deserved to know how the full story had resolved. Douglas's business had contracted in the 2 years since the hearing. Several long-standing professional relationships had ended in the quiet way that professional relationships end when a man's reputation has shifted in ways that cannot be directly confronted. He was still operating, still present, but at a diminished scale that bore no resemblance to the confident empire he had presented in that courtroom. She did not say this with satisfaction. She said it the way you report a fact that confirms something you already understood, that a life built on the diminishment of others is not a stable structure. That cruelty presented as triumph has a way of becoming neither. She thought about the $2 bill. It was in a frame now hanging in the farmhouse kitchen on the wall beside the window that looked out over the fields. The pencil numbers were still there in the lower margin, faint but legible. 42 years of being carried in Douglas's breast pocket, and in the end, it had been the key to everything. Her father had understood something that required a very particular kind of intelligence, that a certain type of man will keep his trophies indefinitely, and that the surest way to deliver something precious to someone who needs it is to place it in the hands of someone who will guard it carefully without ever knowing what it is. She placed her hand on the cold granite. They're putting your seeds in the ground in 4 states this spring, Dad. Farmers who couldn't grow anything on their land before your varieties. Families who are going to have harvests because of something you figured out alone in a field with a notebook. She paused. A wind moved through the cemetery carrying the smell of turned earth and dried leaves. October in this part of the country, she had known that smell since she was a child. I think about you every morning when I walk those fields. I think about what it must have taken to keep going that quietly for that long. No recognition, no validation, no one telling you that what you were doing mattered. Just the work and the belief that it did. She waited as though giving him time to hear. It mattered, Dad. It mattered more than anyone knew, and now everyone knows. She stood. She brushed the grass from her coat. She folded the annual report and put it back in her pocket. She looked at the headstone one last time, at her father's name, at the dates that bracketed a life that had been so much larger than it appeared from the outside. And she allowed herself a moment of something she had not felt in its pure form in longer than she could remember. Gratitude. Not for the money, though the money had changed everything in the practical sense. Not for the justice, though the justice had been real and complete. For the love. For the specific and extraordinary love of a man who had looked at his daughter and seen not who she was at her worst, but who she was capable of becoming, and had spent his entire life building toward that capacity rather than toward his own comfort or recognition or ease. That was the inheritance. The $2 bill had been the delivery mechanism. The inheritance was the love behind it, and the 40 years of patient work that love had generated. And the proof documented and validated and permanently recorded that she had always been worth protecting. Margaret Colton was 71 years old. She had lost 4 decades to a man who had seen her as a transaction. But she had the farm and the fields and the seeds and her father's journals and her children and the work of the trust stretching out ahead of her into a future she could not have imagined 2 years ago and could not now imagine being without. She got in her car and drove back down the county road toward the farm, toward the oak tree and the porch and the timber building full of her father's life work, toward the kitchen where the $2 bill hung framed on the wall beside the window, toward everything that had been waiting for her all along. Some fortresses are built from stone and money and legal maneuvers, and some are built from seeds and notebooks and a father's quiet refusal to let the world's opinion of him become the final word on his daughter's worth. Walter Bridwell had known the difference. He had spent 50 years proving it, and the woman he had built it all for was going home. They thought a $2 bill was the end of her story. It was the first sentence of the one that mattered.